All right, welcome. This session discusses how the science and technology of renewable energy can be addressed through an integrated approach to basic planning tools using examples from a variety of Colorado communities. We have 4 panelists involved in this discussion. My name is Austin Flanagan. I'm an attorney at Clarion Associates, a national land use consulting firm based out of Denver. Prior to joining Clarion, my work focused on renewable energy regulation with our next panelist, Taylor Curtis. I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Austin, and good morning. I am Taylor Curtis, and I'm a regulatory and policy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, as Austin mentioned, located in Golden, Colorado. And today I've been asked to talk to you about planning for and regulating renewable energy exploration and development that is used to provide heat and electricity to local communities. Next slide. A few years ago in Colorado, the energy mix for electricity generation was about 75% traditional energy sources and about 25% renewable energy. Today, the percentage of renewable energy as a whole has increased since these 2018 numbers. For instance, just this morning, I read that solar now makes up almost 4% of Colorado's energy mix now, which is almost double from what it was just a couple years ago. And the increase in renewable energy over the last few years and over the last decade really in Colorado has been driven by a number of different factors, one of which is policy, such as the 2004 Renewable Energy Standard, which was a ballot initiative, one of the first in the nation, that required utilities to obtain 10% of their electricity from renewable energy sources by 2015. Colorado met that 2015 objective, and the legislature has increased the percentage required 3 more times over the years. And most recently, the governor has implemented a plan for Colorado to be 100% renewable electricity by 2040. And electric utilities are also falling on this path. The state's largest electric utility, Xcel Energy, has implemented a plan to be 100% carbon free by 2050. And it's not all that uncommon now to see utilities and energy companies and governments kind of diversifying their portfolio. And in fact, NREL has contracts with some of the biggest oil and gas companies. We have contracts right now with Shell and ExxonMobil and BP. Next slide. Decision makers are transitioning towards renewable energy in large numbers today because the benefits of renewable energy are more widely known. And some of those rumors or myths about renewable energy have been debunked over time. For instance, I think about the concern of solar panels, that there used to be kind of a thought that solar panels reflect the sun and that they created a dangerous glare. And well, that's simply not true. And solar panels are actually designed to absorb the sun, and they have no more of a glare than, say, when the sun hits water on a lake, or when the sun hits a window. Also, the economics of renewable energy over the years have become a lot more competitive than they used to be, mostly due to technology innovation. For instance, solar has seen a 30% or 38% cost reduction over just the last 5 years, which is pretty significant. So in addition to being more cost competitive, the technology has come a long way. It's more durable. There's been great advances in co-location in the last decade, kind of demonstrating that agriculture and other land use activities are not mutually exclusive from renewable energy development, that you can still have dual uses for land. So for instance, wind plus grazing, or solar plus grazing, or solar plus bee pollination, etc. NREL and other research institutes have been working on the co-location aspect of renewable energy development for nearly a decade now. So some of those land use activity displacement concerns have been mitigated. The economics for local communities also look really good. Renewable energy development and operation can create 3 times more jobs per dollar invested than conventional electricity generating technologies. There's also been a number of environmental, human health, and security benefits, some of which I've outlined here. Reduced air and water pollution, lower greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide as compared to coal and natural gas, which correlates to reduced human health concerns. Security and reliability benefits, diverse energy portfolios correlate with electric grid stability and increases in supply chain stability. And reduces reliance on imports. So, the oil embargo of the 1970s, or the gas shell booms and busts that we've seen over the years, those don't really happen with renewable energy. Next slide, thank you. So what is the science behind some of these technologies, and why is understanding the science behind renewable energy technologies important to developing regulation? So solar, for instance, solar panels and cells are made of semiconducting technology that converts sunlight or photons or particles of the sun into electricity. And at a high level, it's important to understand the basics of science behind these technologies and future innovation in these technologies to avoid drafting regulation or regulatory requirements that may inadvertently kind of restrict or prohibit renewable energy exploration and development. So for instance, establishing a clear foundation with an inclusive and comprehensive definition of, say, what a solar energy system is can prevent misinterpretation, and it also can remove future barriers associated with technology design changes or application changes. For instance, an application changes, NREL and the US Department of Energy are focused on solar to X initiatives. And so what that means is solar for buses, or solar for highways, or solar for applications that we haven't yet thought of. So it's important to keep that in mind when drafting regulation. Next slide. It's also important to have an understanding of other regulatory frameworks that impact renewable energy development, such as federal and state regulatory requirements. In addition to local regulations, such as zoning regulations and land use plans that Austin and Elizabeth will talk about in depth, there are a number of state and federal regulatory requirements for renewable energy development. There's for land access, there's state and federal land right-of-ways, easements over private land, use leases that might come up with geothermal projects or wind projects, state highway right-of-way permits that might be required for transporting large construction equipment on state highways, Public Utility Commission facility licensing certificates and interconnection requirements, in addition to a number of cultural and biological protection regulations, federal and state water quality and air quality protection regulations, federal and state geological protections, aesthetic and recreational resources, waste and hazardous materials regulation, water access and water rights, as well as other transmission, siting, and interconnection requirements. So there is a barrage of kind of complex regulatory frameworks and permits and inspections that developers need to comply with, and local communities can play a big role in the development of clean energy electricity and job creation in their communities by regulating renewable energy development in a way that makes sense, that takes into account current and future technology, the scale of the renewable energy project being developed or regulated, other federal and state regulatory frameworks, and regulation that understands the basics of how those technologies work so that they can regulate the impacts of the renewable energy development in a way that avoids inadvertently inhibiting or prohibiting renewable energy development for your community. And that's all I have, and I'll be open for questions.
Okay, thanks, Taylor. Before we move on to the next section, I just want to pause and see if you can share a few NREL resources that you suggest that the public can access to gain a better understanding of the state and federal regulatory requirements for renewable energy.
Thank you, Shelby. Yeah, one big project that comes to mind is the Regulatory and Permitting Information Desktop Toolkit, which Austin actually helped with, or the Rapid Toolkit for short. This is kind of a one-stop shop for state and federal regulations for different wind, solar, geothermal, and bulk transmission development. That's a really great resource. There's also this tool called Slope that I just found out about, and it is a state and local planning tool for energy development, and it's a data-driven tool that helps communities identify renewable energy potential within and resources within their communities, and how to integrate those technologies into their communities' kind of existing infrastructure. Thanks.
Yep, I'm a big fan of that Slope tool as well. So in transition, my name is Shelby Summer, and I am a planner with Brendel Group, and we are a sustainability-oriented company. We focus primarily in the areas of water, energy, and climate. So I do a lot of work with municipalities as well as utilities on renewable energy planning and resiliency efforts. So I'm going to be talking about planning and where planners might be interacting with and setting the stage for renewable energy in their communities. So first, I'm going to start with some just documents where you might be starting to see or elevate the prominence of renewable energy in your community. So these are just a few examples on the slide here, not a comprehensive list. So first off, there's no requirement for an energy element in a comprehensive plan, like there may be in some other states. Minnesota is one that comes to mind. That said, a comprehensive plan or master plan is a great place to establish a vision for renewable energy, as well as establish some policies for future decision making. Many communities have adopted or in the process of adopting sustainability or climate action plans. These are also great opportunities to establish aggressive renewable energy or climate goals. These are also a natural place for your renewable energy planning information, your goals, your strategies, and your actions in order to achieve that vision. It's important with sustainability and climate action plans to be aware of the fact that they're not necessarily going to get into the land use and development considerations that a comprehensive plan might address with respect to renewable energy. So if you adopt renewable energy goals in your sustainability or climate action plan, you're probably going to want to double back to your comprehensive plan at some point, as well as your development regulations, just to make sure those considerations are thought through. Many communities have economic development plans and strategies. And so communities across the country are looking at how they might grow primary employment in industries like renewable energy. So this is a great place to elevate your vision and goals for renewable energy, not just from sort of the environmental standpoint, but from that economic perspective. Similarly, communities that have an economy that's really centered around an extractive industry, oil or gas, they might be preparing for a transition of that economy. And so this concept of just transition planning is emerging in Colorado, and another way to have that renewable energy conversation with your community. Then finally, capital improvement plans and utility master plans. So by and large in Colorado, I'm not seeing a lot of these types of plans addressing renewable energy, partly because a lot of municipalities don't have a municipal electric or gas utility, and therefore they're kind of putting it on the utility to do that planning. But I think looking to the future, thinking about coordinated right-of-way planning as well as siting can be an important consideration for future updates to those plans. So once you've decided where renewable energy is going to show up, whether your comprehensive plan or any of these others, here's some interesting things to be thinking about, and the different scales for which this might show up in these documents. So first of all, a vision. This highlights generally what's most important to your community. And so it could be clean energy, it could be environmental benefits, could be job creation, equity. Most community vision statements around energy don't prioritize one type of renewable energy over another, but they set the stage for overall renewable energy adoption. Focus or opportunities areas can be a helpful technique to sort of break that vision into more digestible components. This can be really helpful for co-writing efforts later as well. So your focus or opportunity areas might be renewable energy types, so wind, solar, geothermal, and the like. Could be scale, and I'll talk a little bit more about scale in a little bit here. Or it could even be by sectors, so residential, commercial, municipal, and the like. Goals establish what you're trying to achieve. And so seeing a lot of different types of renewable energy goals in communities. It could be incremental, so like an annual percentage increase. It could be a longer term or aspirational goal, carbon neutrality by 2050 or renewable electricity by 2030. Or it could be a specific target of a quantifiable amount of generation, like 1 megawatt of solar, for example. Policies are there to guide decision-making, especially in that land use development context. And then strategies may be necessary in order to help you move on the pathway towards achieving goals. And so this is probably going to be necessary if you have ambitious goals, and it's going to be necessary in addition to the policy development. So as an example, if you're a community that really wants to have community solar, you may need some active strategies to be looking at siting for that community solar garden, rather than just saying, hey, we want community solar. You may have to put some more skin in the game to get there. So next slide. So in terms of how I think about renewable energy planning, and I think a lot in the utility industry think about it, is at sort of these three different scales. These aren't really concrete, but it's just kind of some rules of thumb about how I like to think about the different scales. So at the site scale, we're thinking about an individual property and sort of the uses on or next to that building or facility. So helpful to think about things like ground or roof mounted solar. And these are typically accessory uses. Considerations at the site scale might include height, historic compatibility, and readiness. So whether or not your building codes are saying you need to build to a solar ready kind of requirement. At the community scale, or sometimes we call it the district scale, you're thinking about sort of groups of buildings or properties, and usually quite a bit larger systems. Sometimes these are a primary use on a property, and sometimes they're a very prominent accessory use. And so some things to be thinking about in addition to the considerations at the site scale that we talked about, you need to think about compatibility, landscaping, and just overall site access. And so an important consideration at the community scale, especially with solar, is that usually community solar facilities are owned in shares or are leased. And so there's just a different sort of relationship to the property. Then lastly, at the utility scale, just these are the much larger solar arrays, wind farms, and these are typically very significant primary uses. And I think it's helpful to think about them as any other large utility infrastructure, whether it's a water treatment facility or any other type of energy generation facility. And think about the infrastructure benefits and the sort of necessity of that infrastructure, as well as the trade-offs and challenges. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So next slide. I want to wrap up with just a few tips and things I've observed as a planner in this space in Colorado, and just some recommendations for planners as you approach this issue with your community. So first and foremost, utilities are really important to involve in the conversation. I've seen it time and time again where a community gets off on a path of visioning and goal setting, and they're kind of leaving the utility out of the conversation. And it's just really important to understand where they're going as an organization and their renewable energy goals, so that your community can link to or diverge from those goals. Many utilities are becoming increasingly sophisticated with their data capabilities. And so reach out, ask, and see what data are available. There's lots of cool tools and resources through NRail if your utility is unable to provide that data to you. The third one is my favorite. It's clarification of what you mean by energy. So seeing a lot of communities recently adopting 100% renewable energy goals and not really being clear what they mean by that. And so I think a lot of them are intending to adopt 100% renewable electricity goals, but by calling it more broad energy goals, they're kind of overlooking the fact that energy encompasses other things like natural gas and propane. So it's just really important to have that conversation and be really specific in your language. Elizabeth's going to talk a little bit more about anticipating emerging technologies. So I just want to keep the door open as planners to changes and in this evolving landscape. Then I want to wrap up with just one recommendation, is to think beyond renewable energy in your community's energy visioning and goal setting, and don't just focus in on renewable energy, because at the end of the day, you're going to need, as a community or utility, to be building to the greatest sort of generation needed. And so by reducing the amount of energy that's required, you can also limit the scale of the impacts of those facilities and the construction of them. So if we can reduce how much energy we're using through efficiency measures, then we have to build less renewable energy overall. So with that, kind of wrapped up my section, and Austin, we'll start transitioning to you.
Thanks, Shelby. That was great. Before we move on to some land use code suggestions, for a community that wants to get started planning for renewable energy, what are some primary considerations or recommendations for them to begin that process?
Thanks, Austin. Talked about this a fair amount already, but I do think it's important to just research what your utility is regulated or committed to doing, their goals and their pathway, and then you can kind of check in with your community through a planning process to see, is that sufficient? Are you in alignment with your utility's goals, or do you want to be more aggressive than that? And if so, then you can start that conversation of how you're going to get there. But yeah, check with your utility first.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelby. Okay, so we're going to turn now to some of the land use code recommendations and considerations. So turning what Taylor and Shelby were talking about, the science and plan, and to land use regulations. So let's start by discussing where these types of regulations show up in your land use code. Most commonly, they show up as part of the use regulations. Occasionally, we see them as standalone chapters, but we think integrating them with the uses is the most user-friendly approach. If you don't have a use table or chapter, then you can list them under each district. The screenshot here shows how Buena Vista integrated their renewable energy regulations into their land use code. You can see they've accounted for geothermal, solar, and wind. So one of the first considerations after we find out where these regulations are going to show up in the land use code is if and how the different technologies should be tiered. In other words, how can the regulations account for the vast differences in the type and scale of these technologies? So thinking back to Shelby's discussion of the site, community, and utility scale, and how those scales could affect the potential impacts. So you can see Buena Vista did decide to tier, and they did so based on size, small or large facilities for each technology. I'm going to walk through a couple of alternatives and give some recommendations for how certain regulations for each technology could be tiered in the next couple of slides. The goal being that if we're able to account for the differing scales and types of these technologies, then the potential impact of each can be effectively addressed, and that should make way for more renewable energy development. So ideally, low impact systems like residential geothermal or roof-mounted solar could be allowed by right in all districts, whereas high impact systems could be allowed in compatible districts with use-specific standards that account for potential impacts. Let's dive into some of the regulations. We're going to start with solar. For each of these technologies, I'm going to list some of the primary considerations, as you can see here, and then we'll dive into one example from a Colorado community. These are certainly not exhaustive lists. For solar, we think an effective way to tier is based on whether it is ground or building mounted. Parking canopy is a potential third variety, but it could also be included with ground mounted solar. So tiering solar in this way allows for the standards to be tailored based on the differing types of solar technology and their corresponding impacts. For instance, if a locality decides to include screening requirements for solar, that can and should look very different depending on whether the solar is attached to a roof or whether it's on the ground. Similarly, any setback and height requirements can be adjusted depending on these tiers. Before I walk through an example, I want to point out a couple of the pictures on this slide. So the top right is an example of agrivoltaics. That is solar being placed above agriculture. It's a newer type of ground-mounted solar. The bottom right is Tesla's solar shingle roof, where the shingles are actually PV cells. This type of roof-mounted solar is very different than our traditional concept of roof-mounted solar. And I wanted to point these out as a couple of examples of how this technology has changed in recent years, and that it's important to keep these technological changes in mind when drafting the regulations. So Elizabeth is going to talk to us a bit more about how we can plan for those types of technological changes in the land use code. But before we get there, let's get to an example of some solar regulations. This is El Paso County's, or a snippet of El Paso County's regulations for solar. You can see that El Paso decided to tier, and they tiered based off attached and detached. And that's another way of saying building or ground mounted respectfully. The El Paso height restrictions do a great job of showing the effectiveness of this type of tiering, where solar attached to a building gets an extra 5 feet of height above the district maximum, and building mounted has its own separate requirement. So let's think back to the last slide of those two pictures. And you can see how tiering in this way accounts for those different technologies. It wouldn't prohibit them. So agrivoltaics would be allowed or permitted under this regulatory scheme, even though it might not have been a technology that was in existence when these were written. Let's now talk about wind. For wind, we think there are a couple of ways you can tier to account for impacts. No matter which is chosen, each will give options to tailor the regulations based on the relative impact. Probably the most prevalent way of tiering currently is by the size of the turbine. Size meaning the amount of energy the turbine is generating. We see that type of tiering for solar and geothermal as well, and we don't think that that's the most effective way to address the concerns raised by each technology. And it doesn't really account for technological changes either that have made these technologies much more efficient. So these pictures do a nice job of showing the scale of wind energy with small turbines mounted on a roof in the bottom left image and large commercial turbines on the right. It starts to play out the idea of what matters here is what your neighbors are seeing and hearing, and not the capacity of these technologies. Okay, so here is an example from Weld County. It gives some indication of how Weld decided to tier their wind regulations. They did it by district type. So the image here shows what decibel limits mean in practice. A car driving by is about 70 decibels. So in Weld, the decibels as measured from the nearest property line are adjusted by these district types. Residential, commercial, light industrial, and industrial properties all have their own decibel limitation. This approach does a really nice job of tiering based on impact. And generally, we think if you are going to include decibel limitations, it's a good idea to also include an out clause for acts of nature like storms that could increase the decibel reading over a very short period of time. Last but not least, let's talk about geothermal. So one of the main considerations for geothermal is permitting it and regulating it. Taylor talked about earlier, we don't have any commercial geothermal systems yet in Colorado, but there is a huge capacity potential for this technology here. And I think it won't be long until we start to see more of it. An effective way to tier geothermal regulations is based off the commercial or non-commercial divide. Non-commercial is really another way of saying residential. The pictures show how these technologies work and how different they are depending on whether the system is commercial, shown here on the left, or non-commercial, a residential system, shown on the right. So you can see that a residential geothermal system is typically all underground, whereas commercial facilities typically include above ground structures like a cooling tower to which height requirements might apply. So we weren't able to track down geothermal regulations in Colorado, so instead we're going to turn to Iron County in Utah. These are standards for a commercial geothermal system. As explained in the previous slide, residential geothermal standards should be really different from these. I think some of the standards here could even be less prescriptive. For instance, the minimum lot size seems a bit high to me, and I wonder if restrictions on height and noise could effectively mitigate the impacts. Nonetheless, Iron County does give us an example of how these regulations could play out in practice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Austin. Before I wrap up with my final couple slides, I do want to ask you, what suggestions do you have for local governments who want to encourage and attract more renewable energy development?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of things that localities can do to encourage renewable energy development. I think first, you could take into account some of the recommendations we've given in this presentation. Think about the science, think about the scale of these technologies, get out front of some of the common planning issues and regulate both based on impacts and for the future, knowing that these technologies are going to change. And if you want to go beyond those, and many communities have, you could include incentives for renewable energy development. One example of an incentive is allowing an extra floor of height if you attach solar to your roof. but there are loads of other incentive options as well. And lastly, and somewhat abstractly, I think that you can start representing yourself as a community that welcomes renewable energy development. And the example I'm thinking of is Lincoln County in eastern Colorado. If you go on Lincoln County's website, one of the first things you'll see is wind turbines. It's in their county logo. And they also so happen to be the county with the most wind generation in Colorado. And I'm not sure which came first, but I think those little things go a long way.
Thanks, Austin. So I'm going to wrap up the last couple slides here, and we're going to do a little crystal ball gazing, looking around the corner into the future. So one of the things that both, actually all of the speakers, Taylor, Shelby, and Austin touched on is what are we doing down the road with utility scale renewable energy generation? And in the past, we certainly have communities that have utility scale renewables. I'm sure everyone from Colorado has driven around to see wind turbines, which aren't too hard to find around here, or solar installations, also not too hard to find around here. Austin told us the geothermal installations, like the one on the bottom right of this image, are a little harder to find. This one is from Nevada. And the solar project is the Gemini project on the left, also from Nevada. But as we look forward and we try to figure out as a community how we want to embrace perhaps and bring utility scale renewable energy into our community, a great model to think about is a distributed energy system. I borrowed a picture from the US EPA on the top left of the screen that kind of looks at how we place uses and move energy around. And the interesting thing about this image is that it has moved the energy production facility outside of the community, adjacent to what looks like a lake there. And that may be how your community wants to do it, but it may be that you want to start thinking about, instead of separating all these uses and creating distance between them, perhaps considering how to better integrate some of our energy production uses into the community. Shelby suggested that we start with our planning processes. And one of the big questions there really is, can the system be brought into the community? So instead of starting with the assumption that it needs to go somewhere else, ask the question, how can we do it? If we decide that we can do it, we want to take a look at our zoning regulations and consider back again in the zone districts and the uses where Austin had us thinking about the different tiers of energy generation. Will larger scale utility generation work well with other large scale uses in our communities? Large scale uses could be public uses, could be open spaces or conservation areas, could be ag production areas. One example that we can all take a look at is a university campus, which tends to pull together a variety of uses, including on many campuses, their source of energy production. And so when we think about what they do on a more constrained space than a community does, typically in a larger space, we can start thinking about, do we want to create an energy campus? Or, as some communities have done, do we want to set up an industrial mixed-use district? Is there some way that we want to bring the source of production into the bigger parts of our community? So when we've decided if we can do it and our general approach to how we want to do this, then we really need to take a look at creating the regulations in advance of siting. One thing that is super challenging is to regulate a project at the same time it's being proposed. So if you have the luxury of time and are thinking about doing this down the road, perhaps look at some of the resources that we're going to provide you at the end of this presentation and consider locations in your community where you might want to see larger scale energy production, and then start working through the issues that go with that, which will include access, screening, that's okay, Austin, go ahead, support infrastructure, transmission wires. Don't try to draft on the fly. So finally, rounding out our presentation, when you draft code, you draft it for a period of time, usually 20 to 25 years. I know that I've worked on updating zoning and subdivision regulations that have been around much longer than that. And one of the places where we get stuck is that we put regulations in a zoning code and we leave them there. And in a situation like renewable energy, where the technology is changing rapidly, it's entirely possible that you'll open your code and find you can't approve a project that really should be approved because the language isn't there, or the language got dated, doesn't account for the technology. So we're going to give you a handful of tips here to keep those regulations fresh, a little more fresh than they might be if you adopt them and do nothing. And actually the first tip is minimize the amount of regulation that you do for that tier 1 for site generation. That's, you know, kind of residential scale alternative energy development. And so that might be solar on the roof, and might be the batteries that you see here. These are internal and they are also external on some structures, but consider whether or not this has to be part of the zoning regulations. And if not, then just let it go, or limit regulation to safety. What we don't want to do is inadvertently create barriers to allowing site scale production. And so the other thing that you want to do in this category is go through the regulations and clear out those regulations that might create some sort of a barrier. So if we know the solar panels probably need to be 6 to 10 inches above the roof, and the roof was built to the height in the zone district, consider ways to allow those panels to go on as an exception that does not require an approval process. The more process we add to renewable energy, the more barriers we throw up to applicants who want to use this approach on their property. Second suggestion is to allow the supporting tech to be approved as part of the primary use, not through a secondary permit process. So if your community has production ag, you might want to think about allowing the agrivoltaic solar systems to be approved as part of that, the image that Austin showed us earlier. Add a statement in the code about the potential for changing technology, and specify that should the technology change in a way that lessens the impact, it can still be approved through whatever process was created by the older technology. So we don't want to get stuck on technicalities in technology. So if for some reason we find the solar panels that we see on this image are shrunk next year, or they're rolled into the roofing material, or the Tesla shingles become affordable for everybody, we don't want our code to get in the way of being able to approve that. So allow for that technology change. Add a process, preferably an administrative process, to allow minor measurement adjustments in the code to accommodate new technology. Don't make applicants look for a variance if they need a 6-inch change in the height again, or if they need something to encroach into the setback somewhat. Figure out a way to make that easier to do. Follow the old adage of making the good simple. We've all heard that with form-based codes, for sure. We can use that for alternative energy. Add a process to interpret in new technology and amend the code. So you might want to say, hey, we're now allowing solar shingles, and before we spoke only to solar panels, but we're going to amend the code, and we're going to say we mean solar panels and solar shingles. So keep up with technology by adding it to the code. And then finally, name somebody on the staff or in the community who's the technical lead, who's the solar super person, and allow them to regularly teach everybody else about new technology, and also to make suggested edits to the code to keep it current. So someone needs to have some ownership over these part of the regulations, and they need to be the one that brings it forward and makes the changes over time so the code stays current. So those are our big tips for once you get this information in the regulation, how to keep the regulations current.
Excellent advice, Elizabeth. You can tell you've been doing this for some time. What changes have you seen in local government regulation of renewable energies over the last decade?
Thanks, Taylor. Quite a bit, actually. So I think that we have gone from a place of consultants encouraging local government to add these regulations to their regulations, to a place where now we are asked regularly to help draft these standards. And even better, we see regular situations where we are asked to update standards that have dated over time. So this has certainly become an aspect of regulation across the various platforms. So you see alternative energy, you see wind and solar and geothermal in traditional or Euclidean codes, you see it in form-based codes, and you see it in performance codes. So there isn't a code out there that you can't add this to. I think probably the other change that I've seen over time is that the regulations have become more refined. Sorry, I lost my notes there for a second. I've been so engrossed in kind of listening to everybody. The regulations have become refined, and what Shelby and Austin talked about, in particular, the scale or the tiering of the regulations is something that we see happening more often. And I think that helps communities and users understand the potential impacts of the different regulations. So thanks for asking that, Taylor.
Yeah, awesome.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I think we have time to do maybe one question. And the question I have, I think we'll start with Taylor, and then if others want to jump in, please feel free to. So Taylor, what happens when the sun isn't shining or the wind just isn't blowing? What do we do in those cases, or what are some ways that we can plan for those scenarios?
Yeah, excellent question. That has been a challenge, or used to be a challenge, I would say, for renewable energy. And battery energy technology, battery energy storage technology has advanced exponentially over the last decade, and honestly just within the last few years, to be more cost, it's not as cost prohibitive as it used to be on a utility scale. It's a lot more efficient than it used to be, and is a great solution to storing renewable energy when those scenarios happen. Another thing that is a little bit newer, but that we are starting to see pop up, is kind of co-locating renewable energy with other technologies, like wind with geothermal, or solar with hydropower. And hydropower is a storage technology as well as a generating technology. It's the movement of water from one reservoir to the other, so you can generate electricity during kind of off-peak hours, or in the case of where maybe it's not, if it's paired with wind or solar and it's not sunny that day, or windy. But in terms of batteries, that's really where a lot of the technology has been focused, and it shows by the increase that we've seen in deployment. I'll do a shameless plug for a report that I am currently drafting that should be out in the next couple months, where we have seen that the U.S. energy market for batteries is expected to go from over 500 megawatts to 7 gigawatts, over 7 gigawatts within the next 5 years. And that is a huge, huge change. The megawatts, for those who are less familiar with units, are usually used to for kind of medium and large scale utility operations. It's 1,000 kilowatts in 1 megawatt, and gigawatts are sizes of cities or small states in terms of their capacity. So one gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and that is so for instance, I think one megawatts is like over 3 million solar panels. So pretty big difference in moving from 500 megawatts to 7 gigawatts of battery energy storage in the U.S. is a huge advancement, and is going to really help bring renewable energy technology forward.
Awesome. Wow. Thank you for that. That was an incredible answer. Does anyone else want to jump in? I think you really nailed it there, Taylor.
Yeah, I'll just build on Taylor's comments and just say, you know, the supply of energy has always been balanced, you know, the different sources, and there's a lot of behind the scenes work on grid balancing. And so that's not changing necessarily with renewable energy. It's just shifting which sources you're pulling from. Most properties are connected to utility infrastructure and the grid. And so the average property owner doesn't necessarily need to be concerned about not having energy if their on-site solar is not producing, because they have that backup supply through their electric provider. And if you have an off-grid situation, sure, it's very important to be thinking about storage and be planning for that. But I would say by and large, most properties are connected to the grid, and that balancing is happening at a utility, even now, even a regional scale. And so it's not something that the average community or property owner has to be overly concerned with.
That's a great
Yeah, good point.
Thank you guys for that. With that, I think we're at about time. Thank you for these incredible panelists. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I just want to end with saying we have a slide of resources here, and these slides will be available. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation.
Thanks for hosting us all.